Right. Let us pray. Good and gracious God, we thank you for this day and for the opportunity to be in service to you. You promise to never leave us or forsake us, and for that we are so grateful. Remind us of that every day as we hit the bumps of life, but we just thank you for each other and for the opportunity to be in community and to work on your behalf and be your light and love in our community. We thank you for Margaret and for her presentation today. I pray that you will open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to know what you are sharing with us, to then that we can then lead into our lives and into our relationships. And it is in your name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Sherry.
Welcome. Do you want me to put the slides up?
Yes, please. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I heard this podcast, if you will, one Sunday morning. It's On Being. It's an NPR program, and it was featuring Dr. Pauline Boss, and she was talking about ambiguous loss. Next screen, Sherry. I've never heard this term, but I thought, oh my, I've experienced this, as all of us have. So you're gonna find areas here that you'll see listed that a lot of us have experienced, and those situations where someone leaves us without a goodbye, and then there's those that we have a goodbye but they don't leave. So and that's something that the column on the right, especially in working in memory care, I see these examples with patients with dementia. And sometimes if the family's been away from that loved one for a while, or for example, during COVID, when we would do the FaceTime visits, and let's say it's been a couple weeks, and we schedule those visits with the family, and the family, I noticed when they came on and saw their loved one, you would see almost, instead of like this excitement, there would be this sadness, because they're losing the person that they remember. And that's disheartening. And, to hear this podcast on ambiguous loss, I thought that's exactly what Pauline Boss is talking about. But there's other areas too, when we lose, when our family member or friend is struggling with mental illness, we've lost the person that we knew. Autism is another example, even hoarding disorder. People get lost in their material and they detach. We lose them to the material possessions. And then back to the column here on the left, leaving without goodbye, suicide. It could be a war-related loss. She talks about in this audio about the soldiers during the Vietnam War, those missing in action. I mean, can you even imagine? No, I can't, but just the loss of that person, but you never have a body come back, and to really have closure. So she talks about too, the myth of closure. Suicide, young adults leaving home, maybe, that leave on not so good terms and they detach from their parents. Next slide, Sherry.
Oops.
So really, she talks about it being a relational rupture, and it can be physical or physiological. Am I saying that right? It can create the symptoms such as depression or a persistent complex bereavement disorder. And then, because the family story of loss may never have an ending, the therapeutic goal shifts to resiliency, which this goes back to, if you were on for the Lunch and Learn when I did on compassion fatigue, we talked about resiliency and building that resolve, strengthening your resolve. So it does circle back to that, because really that is your only way to cope, or you get lost in it and it just takes over your whole life. So building resiliency is one way to overcome. Next slide, and we can begin. It's about a 50-minute audio, and it's from On Being. And go ahead and we'll start that. It's about 50 minutes long, and enjoy. You'll get a lot out of this. Thanks, Sherry.
On Being is brought to you by the John Templeton Foundation, harnessing the power of the sciences to explore the deepest and most perplexing questions facing humankind. Learn how their grantees are helping to address the coronavirus crisis at templeton.org.
You could say of 2020 that we are suddenly in a world of ambiguous loss. Pauline Boss coined this term and invented a new field within psychology to name the reality that every loss does not hold a promise of anything like resolution. In this year of pandemic, there are so many losses, many now just settling in, from deaths that could not be mourned, to the very structure of our days, to a sudden crash of what solid careers and plans and dreams. When I spoke with Pauline Boss about her groundbreaking wisdom in 2016, she illustrated it with ambiguous life changes like illness, divorce, and aging. Those too are still happening right now. So we offer up this conversation anew, full of practical intelligence for shedding assumptions about how we should be feeling and acting that actually deepen stress precisely in a moment like this.
We like to solve problems. We're not comfortable with unanswered questions. And this is full of unanswered questions. These are losses that are minus facts.
I'm Krista Tippett, and this is On Being. Pauline Boss introduced ambiguous loss in her 1999 book of that title. Now an emeritus professor at the University of Minnesota, she's called in for counsel by families, corporations, governments, and NGOs across the world, including throughout this year's pandemic. She grew up in a first-generation Swiss-American immigrant family in Wisconsin. Here's a line I found in your writing that I feel, to me, I would say this is also a description of spiritual background, and also I think a bridge to the work you've ended up doing. I mean, you said homesickness was an essential part of my family's culture.
It was. I think it may be true for all immigrant families, but it certainly was for mine, and it was even in the village because there were many immigrant families there. Mm-hmm. And so it became a sort of pathos that would be in the family when we weren't even aware of it, except that I could see the sadness periodically, like when my father would get a letter from Switzerland, mm-hmm. or worse yet, a letter with a black rim around it, which meant announcement of death in the family. So I was always aware that there was another family somewhere, and that there was some homesickness, except where was home? And I figured that home was in Wisconsin where we lived, but yet I knew he had this other family across the Atlantic that he pined for. And my maternal grandmother was the same. And of course, she refused to learn English, and she said she lost her mountains, she lost her mother, she lost her friends. And she wasn't going to lose her language. Mm. Yeah. So I think that too is not unusual for immigrant families today, especially the elders.
You know, one thing reading that about your family made me reflect on is that we talk a lot about immigrants, right? And especially now.
Yes.
And we even talk about things like people sending money back to family.
Yes.
But we don't kind of acknowledge the grief, or that homesickness, or that sadness, that loss that must always be there, even when people have made a choice to go far away.
I think that's part of our American culture, that we don't want to hear that. Yeah. We don't just deny death in our culture. I think we deny ambiguous loss that comes with things like immigration. And homesickness comes along with that, and we really want people to get over it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And they don't. And so, and in fact, it's paradoxical. The more you want people to get over it, the longer it will take for them. And why not remember your former country, your former island, your former culture, while you're learning to fit into the new one? In other words, having two cultures is what it ends up being. And you have one foot in the old and one foot in the new. And one can live that way. That may be the most honest way to do it.
So what's interesting to me is the way you started thinking about ambiguous loss. You started with this idea of father absence. And you would eventually call this kind of type 2 ambiguous loss, which is somebody's here, but they're not here. I mean, we'll talk some more about these different forms of ambiguous loss. And I think especially this one, the type 1 ambiguous loss that eventually became the other kind of foundation of the field, is very much like the stuff of news headlines. And so if there's this type of ambiguous loss, which is physical presence and psychological absence, which would also be dementia,
right?
Or kind of mental illness where people incrementally disappear. But there's also physical absence and psychological presence. So the person disappears. And so, you know, for me to think about you coining this term in the 1970s and thinking about the MIAs of the Vietnam War, like missing in action, which I remember growing up in those years, we all wore these bracelets, right? Or you had the name of someone. And I think as a child, being aware of how completely traumatizing that was, but probably not understanding that trauma. It's in these kinds of great disasters that you've been called in, where you've been called in to help people with the Red Cross, like the tsunami, where people get swept away.
I didn't intend that.
Yeah. You mean when you started out?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I'm really not I'm not a first responder. I'm not even brave, and I'm not good in the field. But when I was studying this psychological absence, and I gave my first paper on that as a graduate student, the military was in the audience, and they said, if you would reverse this and study physical absence, we would have data for you on the families of the missing in action soldiers.
Oh, so they had experienced that trauma of people not being able to say goodbye and not being able to bury their dead.
And it was the military from the Center for Prisoner of War Studies in San Diego who recognized that. They said, I had a theory and they had data, and could we get together? So I was going to write my dissertation on psychological father absence, so that got dropped. And so instead I wrote it on physical father absence, because at that time the MIAs were all male. And that took me down this road of more disastrous kinds of losses outside the home. And the rest is history.
Yeah. And I feel like, and maybe it's just because I've been aware of your work and kind of in this on and off conversation with you, I feel like these kinds of events are just that much more in our cultural imagination. I mean, you know, the Malaysian airplane that disappears without a trace. And maybe it's also because the cameras are ever present, and we see that these people, these family members, cannot find peace.
And I think it's personal too. We come from culture in this country of, I think, mastery orientation. We like to solve problems. We're not comfortable with unanswered questions. And this is full of unanswered questions. These are losses that are minus facts. Somebody's gone, you don't know where they are, you don't know if they're alive or dead, you don't know if they're coming back. And so that kind of mystery, I think, gives us a feeling of helplessness that we're very uncomfortable with as a society. So I think we're taken to this idea that we see in the paper all the time. It's not always called ambiguous loss, but I think those ideas pull people in because of the helplessness of it. And so we say, thank God it's not me.
I'm Krista Tippett, and this is On Being. Today, in a moment of civilizational grief and disorientation, we're revisiting my 2016 conversation about ambiguous loss. Pauline Boss created this field in psychology and family therapy. One thing that you say is that the kind of grief that's involved in ambiguous loss is distinct from traditional grief. So how is it different?
Well, with ambiguous loss, there's really no possibility of closure, not even, in fact, resolution, whichever word you prefer to use. And therefore, it ends up looking like what the psychiatrists now call complicated grief.
Right.
And that is, in fact, a diagnosis, complicated grief. And it requires some kind of psychiatric intervention. My point is very different, that ambiguous loss is a complicated loss, which causes, therefore, complicated grief, but it is not pathological. Individually, that is. It's not a pathological psyche, it's a pathological situation. And as clients frequently say back to me, oh, you mean the situation is crazy, not me. That's exactly what I mean. It's an illogical, chaotic, unbelievably painful situation that these people go through who have missing loved ones, either physically or psychologically. And if they have some symptoms of grief that carry on, let's say even for 5 or 10 years, if it's a caregiver of an Alzheimer's patient or the parent of a missing child, there is nothing wrong with them. That is typical. That is to be expected, that they would grieve along the way for the various things that they are missing. For example, if a child is kidnapped, they may have an extra grief when this child's friends are graduating, or when this child's friends are marrying, or having their first job, or going away for college. So the grief is long-term. It is chronic grief, yes.
So I worked just when I was in divinity school, as a chaplain on an Alzheimer's ward. And I remember watching people come to see their loved one, their spouse, their grandmother, their sister. And I remember, as this person who just wandered in and was about people and care for them, I would be so impatient with how people would be so upset when, they came in and this person didn't remember their name. And over time, I got so much more compassion about that, because I realized that the stress, the difficulty, because it was like an incremental death, right?
That's
so
exactly
every
right.
time they came, there was a little bit more gone, and yet it's this person who looks the same. And it is this monumental struggle for people to peacefully inhabit this reality that this person they love is, as you say, there and not there.
Both here and gone.
But then the other thing that I think we observe culturally, and I guess this is the corollary to it, is I feel like it's kind of mysterious how important it is for human beings to bury their dead.
Yes,
right?
it is.
But how do you understand what that is in us, like as a species, that we...
I don't know if it's so important to bury our dead, but I think it's important for us to know where the body is.
Right, to have a body.
And then we get some mastery by having which rituals we want and burying them where we want or how we want, whether it's scattering of ashes or a burial in the ground. I think that's very important. We need some control when we lose someone like that. But I think it's also has to do with attachment. People want to come back to touch base with where this body is, or where the symbol of this body is. People of the missing, of course, come back to the memorials, like the 9/11 memorial, or the ones in Japan after tsunami, or wherever around the world, Holocaust memorials.
That those touch those places, those
yes.
ones, those that need in us.
they're helpful in place of a burial site. So people who don't know where their loved ones are really, really need memorials. They play a very great function in our psychological well-being.
It's from you that I've learned that, you know, to the extent that we have a cultural vocabulary of grief, it was very much formed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her delineating the 5 stages of grief in 1969: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It's from you I've learned that, in fact, she never meant for those stages of grief to be understood, to be taken on the way we've taken them on, which is that when we encounter any grieving person or any person's loss, even the more traditional forms of loss, we think that's kind of a prescription for what they go through, and then they get to the end.
That's part, again, of a culture of mastery, a culture of problem solving and wanting to move on with things. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross found those 5 stages to be relevant to people who are dying, who are fading into death.
Not someone who's at the loss end of that death.
No, she did not mean that for the family members, but in fact, it blurred over into that, and I don't know if that was her, or I think it was more so her followers. Today, the new research in grief and loss does not recommend linear stages. We like linear stages, though, as the news media really likes it, because, in fact, it has an ending. It has a finite end. If you start with stage 1 and you move on to
You'll
stage
finally
5,
get to acceptance.
you're done. You're no longer grieving. Well, we now know that this is not true, and that human beings live with grief, and in fact are able to live with grief. They don't have to get over it. They don't obsess with it 5 years down the road, but they occasionally remember and are sad, or go to the grave, or have some thoughts about the person who died. And this is normal. So we now know that living with grief is more oscillations of up and down, and those ups and downs get farther apart over time, but they never completely go away, the downs of feeling blue, of feeling sad. And in order to understand this, though, we have to make a difference between depression and sadness.
Right.
And so far that hasn't been made. Depression is an illness that requires a medical intervention. It's a minority of people who have depression. And yet, with the ambiguous loss of, let's say, Alzheimer's disease and 50 some other dementias, caregivers are said to be depressed. Most of the caregivers I have met and studied and treated are not depressed. They're sad, they're grieving, and this should be normalized. And sadness is treated with human connection.
So one of the things that you say, and this is, this makes so much sense, but it's the kind of thing that makes sense, which is that people can't cope with the problem until they know what the problem is.
Yes.
You said with ambiguous loss that once people have a name for it, just that the stress level goes down a bit.
Yes, I learned that by doing it the first time, and that is when you say to people, for example, after 9/11, we were working with the families of the workers who cleaned the trade towers, ran the elevators, and ran the air conditioning and the windows on the World Restaurant. Many of them did not speak English, so we had to translate. And my beginning was this: what you're experiencing is ambiguous loss because your loved ones are still missing. It is the most difficult, most stressful loss there is, but it is not your fault. That's all I would say. And before the translators took over. And the people understood that and felt relieved. After a traumatic event, most people blame themselves. Even if it's a tornado, by the way, I've seen this.
You mean they find ways to think that they were responsible for what happened?
Exactly. There was one woman after 9/11 who had a newborn, and she was blaming herself because she didn't wake her husband up early enough that morning. He had an alarm clock and it didn't go off. He was in the trade tower usually by 8 and out by 9. And on this day, he was late, and so he was in the trade tower when it went down.
Right.
She blamed herself as she was crying. She was at her wit's end. And about a year later, we would meet, by the way, every month or so. About a year later, I complimented her on how lovely her little boy was. He was standing up at that time, leaning on her leg, and she said to me, "Do you remember that story I told you about my husband oversleeping and that it was my fault?" I said, "Yes, I remember." And she said, "Well, he always set the alarm clock." And I realized that finally, and it wasn't my fault. He just wanted another hour to be with us. Now, that's the transformation we're after with ambiguous loss, where she is no longer blaming herself, and she has a meaning that she can live with the rest of her life without too much stress.
You've used this, you've said that dialectical thinking, that paradoxical thinking helps. And I think that's an example of that, but explain that, what you mean by that. Because, and again, I think that's not necessarily instinctive for us, it's creatures, and certainly not in moments when we're stressed.
Yes,
right?
I think it might be a more Eastern way of thinking, actually.
Yeah.
But yes, the only way to live with ambiguous loss is to hold two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time. And these are some examples. With a physically missing, people might say, he's gone, he's probably dead, and maybe not. Or he may be coming back, but maybe not. Those kinds of thinking are common, and it is the only way that people can lower the stress of living with the ambiguity. And children learn it rapidly, and even adults learn it. It doesn't take too long. It is not part of our culture, however. We like finite answers. You're either dead or you're alive. You're either here or you're gone. And let's say you have somebody with dementia or a child with autism, and they're there, but they're not always there. And so once you put that frame on it, people are more at ease. And recognize that that may be the closest to the truth that they're going to get. To say either or, to think in a more binary way, he's dead or he's alive.
Right.
You're either here or you're gone.
Right.
That would involve some denial and lack of truth. So the only truth is that middle way of he may be coming back and maybe not.
But I see so that the inclination that we have is, even culturally, is you know, Americans are such fighters, right?
Yes,
so
we
they'll
are.
say, well, you know, we will solve this mystery, I will find them, we will find a cure, right? Or on the other hand, as friends or colleagues, we kind of want people to get over it, right?
Yes.
Or even as people we love this person and we want them to get over it because it feels like they're kind of choosing pain, I suppose.
And we don't like suffering.
Right.
It's a more Eastern idea that suffering is part of life. Our idea is that suffering is something you should get over, and as you say, cure it or fix it or find some solution for it. The fact of the matter is, that's a good thing, by the way. It is probably what has made our society great and has made technology so wonderful, and cures for diseases and so on. So I don't want to put that down at all. But here's the crux. Now and then, there's a problem that has no solution. Now and then, there are problems that don't have a perfect fix. And then this idea of holding two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time is very useful for stress reduction, yes.
I was listening to you. I think one of the questions that is on many people's minds when you have this conversation is, you know, what do you know about what's the best way to react? And I was listening to you on a call-in show, And people would call in, and everybody had such a unique story, right? And I remember, a woman whose brother, I think, went hiking and just never came back, and it was a wilderness area, and they never found his body. And it was, a decade ago. And I listened to you listening to her, and the question you asked was, and how long has it been? And it was 10 years, 14 years. I think that might be a question that in kind of normal interactions, one might be embarrassed to ask, feel like that would take them back or something. So you asked that, and she answered it. And then you just said, I am so sorry.
I remember that.
Yeah.
There's really nothing else to say. And I think we could help each other in society to learn how to speak to people who have missing loved ones. I think it's perfectly good to ask them, how long has it been? Because they want to tell you how long it's been. And sometimes it's been decades. And for example, with the Holocaust and slavery, shall we go back? And Civil War, and with the Native Americans, and any genocide throughout the world, it can be 100 years and they still remember it. And so it's okay to say, how long has it been? And then to say probably the only honest thing you can say, if you feel it, and that is, I'm sorry. We can't fix it, you see. We can't fix it.
After a short break, more with Pauline Boss. And I'm pleased to say that you can find a companion conversation between me and Pauline in the On Being podcast feed this week. It's our latest episode of Living the Questions. I touched base with her about ambiguous loss and the year 2020. Find that at onbeing.org or wherever podcasts are found.
Support for On Being with Krista Tippett comes from the Fetzer Institute, helping build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. Fetzer envisions a world that embraces love as a guiding principle and animating force for our lives, a powerful love that helps us live in sacred relationship with ourselves, others, and the natural world. Learn more by visiting fetzer.org.
I'm Krista Tippett, and this is On Being. Today, exploring complicated grief, the myth of closure, and learning to hold the losses in our midst with the esteemed family therapist and clinical psychologist, Pauline Boss. She created the field of ambiguous loss. I spoke with her in 2016. It's so interesting how there's this whole new field now of epigenetics, right? Of how trauma transmits itself generationally in the way future generations, not so much as an exact memory, but as a response that is conditioned by the trauma that actually happened to previous generations. And then, recently, as I've been writing, I've been thinking a lot about growing up with a father who was adopted, who had this loss of memory, but, thinking about how that affected me and the family indirectly. So I just curious about how you see that kind of loss that happened to previous generations, like how you see that turn up and how you work with that.
I think there is a generational transmission of trauma regarding ambiguous loss. Drew Gilpin Faust wrote the book, The Republic of Suffering.
The president of Harvard, right?
She's the president of Harvard.
But was she a psychologist originally?
No, she's a historian.
Historian, okay, right.
And she makes the point that our republic, our country, was founded on unresolved loss because of the Civil War and all the tragedy that happened there. And that many of these bodies never came home and so on. So it was not really resolved in the usual way. And as a result, our republic is founded on suffering. And I think she pretty much leaves it there. But I would carry it further by saying it wasn't just the Civil War. It was slavery. It was the uprooting of the American Indians. It was all the immigrants that have come since then, and every genocide that has happened worldwide creates a society of suffering that is ancestral suffering that passes down through family patterns and family processes. Sometimes we don't even know. After the Holocaust, for example, the first generation didn't speak of it.
Right.
Many times the traumatized first generation doesn't speak of it. The soldiers are that way too. Then the second generation wonders why and are angry at their parents. And it may be the third generation, the grandchildren, who finally get the answer. But at any rate,
Of what happened.
Yeah. And why grandpa is the way he is, or why grandma is the way she is. And so the story finally comes out, perhaps because the grandparent is now approaching old age and thinks they better share the story while they still can.
Yeah.
Even when the stories aren't told, however, there's a transmission of the trauma by, let's say, having a parent who is not expressive, a parent who doesn't speak much, a parent who can't show love or emotion, or a parent who may have been brutalized who then passes on the violence. So there's a lot we don't know about what happens when this is transmitted. And what we do need to know is that our society as a whole, not just families, but our society as a whole, I think, is afraid of talking about death and is afraid of talking about suffering and having people gone lost and grieving for a long time, primarily because of this transmission of trauma ancestrally. That we are a nation founded on unresolved grief. As a result, we don't like to talk about death, and we don't for sure like to talk about ambiguous loss.
And one person you refer to often is Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, which many people have read. And of course, he was writing out of this example of horrific violence and loss and ambiguity, and yet insisting on acknowledging the horror of that, right?
He did.
Letting that be true forever, and also insisting that meaning can be found.
Yes, and he was the one who said, without meaning there is no hope, but without hope there is no meaning. So he tied those together. What we know now is that the search for meaning is critical in situations of loss, clear or ambiguous, and in situations of trauma. This is very difficult. For example, if a child dies, or if a child commits suicide, or is murdered, or if a loved one disappears at sea, it's nonsensical. But my point is that too is a meaning. The fact that it's meaningless is a meaning, and it always will be meaningless.
Say some more. What do you mean?
If something is nonsensical, totally without logic, without meaning, as many of these terrible events are, then I think we have to leave it there. But I think we have to label it as it's meaningless. And I can live with something meaningless, someone might say. But what I found is, as long as I have something else in my life that is meaningful.
So the search for meaning remains, that stays vital, but you don't necessarily locate the meaning in that terrible thing. You have to find the meaning elsewhere in your life.
And
let that be good enough.
Exactly. Good enough. I like that term, good enough, Krista. That's, in fact, I wrote a chapter on good enough. We really have to give up on perfection of a perfect answer. There are a lot of situations that have no perfect answer. And so, let's say the mother of a kidnapped child may then, in fact, devote her life to helping prevent children from going missing. And you see that all the time, where people who have terrible things happen to them then transform it into something that may help others. That's a way of finding meaning in meaninglessness.
I mean, you've even started talking, I think the writing you're doing now And I feel like what is absorbing you now is really what the phrase you're using is the myth of closure.
Yes.
That in fact, I don't know when that word got inserted into our vocabulary. Maybe you can speak to that, but that word has led us astray.
I believe that. I think closure, though, is a perfectly good word for real estate and business deals. So I don't want to demonize the word closure.
Yeah.
But closure is a terrible word in human relationships. Once you've become attached to somebody, love them, care about them, when they're lost, you still care about them. It's different. It's a different dimension, but you can't just turn it off. And we look around down the street from me, there's a Thai restaurant where there's a plate of fresh food in the window every day for their ancestors. Are they pathological? No. That's a cultural way to remember your ancestors. And somehow in our society, we've decided once someone is dead, you have to close the door.
Yeah.
But we now know that people live with grief. They don't have to get over it. It's perfectly fine. I'm not talking about obsession, but just remembering.
I want to read something you wrote in The Guardian about some of what you learned at 9/11. You wrote, 1 year later, a New York reporter doing a story on the anniversary of 9/11 asked me why I thought New Yorkers weren't over it yet. My answer, because you are trying to get over it.
Yes.
Paradoxically, as T.S. Eliot suggests, what we do not know about a missing loved one becomes all that we know. Another poet, John Keats, recommends in his letters to a young poet that he develop a capability for living with unanswered questions. Keats calls this negative capability, and this is what it takes to live with loved ones gone missing. This is also the way for the rest of us to stop pressuring these families to find closure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We just have to stop pressuring people to get over it. It's cruel, actually, to do that. I was critical of the news media about their yearning for closure. They like the word closure. But I have to say that once listening to CNN, Anderson Cooper stopped the other reporters and said, it's a bad word. There is no such thing as closure. And I just loved him for that.
Mm.
And I know from his own biography that he knows what loss is. And he understands that there is no closure. So he's the only reporter I've ever heard explain that in the line of his work.
Mm.
And I think the rest of us have to do a better job of it too.
Mm-hmm.
There is no such thing as closure. We have to live with loss, clear or ambiguous. And it's okay. It's okay. And it's okay to see people who are hurting and just to say something simple. I'm so sorry. We really don't have to say more than that.
Sherry, you can pause it there. Stop it there.
Today,
Okay.
And go to the next screen, please. Thank you.
Uh-huh. You want me to play it?
Yes, just the first 2.5 minutes, and then we'll do a discussion
Okay.
real quick. Thank you. Because this is more up to date. This is her comments today.
to talk with you for 20-30 minutes. And, you know, we are putting the show that we did a few years ago, which really lays out the notion of ambiguous loss, the myth of closure. But what I want to just reflect on with you this morning very directly is, what does ambiguous loss mean in a global pandemic?
Well, it means essentially the same thing that it meant on the individual and family level, but suddenly it has this global meaning, which I never intended until the phone started ringing, so to speak. The emails came in with the pandemic saying, isn't this ambiguous loss? So as a theoretician, I was delighted that people, journalists and ordinary people, put it together. That's a dream that an academic wants, is that whatever you do is useful to the general public. But then I began thinking, of course, it's ambiguous loss, but it's more abstract. And it's beyond the individual or family now. It has been raised to a higher level.
Right.
To help us make sense of this nonsensical thing that's going on, this invisible enemy.
Mm-hmm. So we're kind of going through a global civilizational moment of ambiguous loss at a societal level.
Yes, we have lost. Indeed, we have lost our freedom to go about our day as we always have. We have lost our freedom to visit with our loved ones or to have lunch with dear friends. And I must say again, because the school thing is coming up, the young people have lost not only a year, it may be 2 years of what they usually do, is go to school in the usual manner, make friends, socialize, learn. And that generation will have to carry that the rest of their lives.
You can pause it there, Sherry. Thank you.
Yeah.
That podcast is worth listening to a few times over. I get something new and different every time. That was my 4th time hearing it. And, you know, she talked about the trauma of passing on through generation. Wow. I mean, yes, I never thought of that, but I can see where that would be something that gets passed on just in coping mechanisms and how parents role model that. Any thoughts, anyone? Was this new information?
It was new for me. I hadn't heard this term either, this concept.
We've all lived it though, haven't we?
Yep.
I guess that's what I thought when I heard it. It's like, oh, I can put a name to that now, you know, divorce, or my daughter had a stillborn baby last year. And I think about, you know, I've got a lot of parents or folks my age that are celebrating grandchildren, and I'm grieving. Yeah, I'm grieving that, not only for my daughter, but I'm missing out on that. And other examples some of you may have experienced?
Well, I was wondering if a 2-year-old can experience that, because 2-year-olds don't understand yet what's happening, but they form attachments to people. And if this person suddenly disappears, like a grandparent, I wonder if that's possible to be in that category.
Oh, I would think so. Anyone have thoughts? Everyone, you can unmute yourselves.
I don't know if they're not mute.
I think that speaks to the resiliency of the human spirit, right? So 2-year-olds don't have a formed, you know, they're still developing. But my guess is that there probably is, oops, hold on, Jean's coming back in, a sense of loss. But at that age, you know, they're developing other relationships as well, so they don't feel the intensity of the loss like we do as adults. We had a good friend of our family had a daughter who was kidnapped about a year before my sister was killed. And so my parents and, you know, her parents grieved in very different ways, because, you know, I know she doesn't like the word closure, which I get. That was a new concept to me too, that actually makes a whole lot of sense. Maybe it's more resolution, or, coming to terms with the ambiguity. It seems like there should be a word of some kind, but you know, my sister was gone and we knew it, right? But their daughter, they had to live in that really place of ambiguity, not knowing if she would ever return. They never found a body, you know, nothing.
Oh.
So yeah, so this was very interesting.
You know, Jackie, though, that's a good point. I've always thought about when kids lose a parent, young kids lose a parent. So same with losing a grandparent, that process of grief. And so I guess, yeah, that would be ambiguous loss.
Well, it's such a young age, as Sherry was just pointing out, that they don't, at that age, they still don't have an overview. I call it an overview of how life works, how everybody fits in, and they're more like subjective. Everything they do is kind of, they're in a subjective position. They're kind of absorbing everything and without understanding, without having a concept of the way things work and the way life is, and you know what I mean. So therefore that would be very, very sort of a that word ambiguous is good, I guess, because something that you can't pinpoint, you know. But I don't know, I've wondered if that could be similar. It's a different stage in your life when that happens.
I think for a 2-year-old also, they're looking around to all of the older people around them and learning. They're seeing how people are responding to that. And then they're also looking to those older people for that explanation that older people try to make. And I think that really taps into the idea of resilience and learning that resilience. I liked what she had to say about closure being an unrealistic term for loss, because you know, it's been my experience that people can come to certain points of resolution after a significant loss, and then 15, 20, 25 years later, all of a sudden it's like they haven't made any progress with grieving the loss. So viewing it as a process, and I think doing away with that unrealistic expectation that people need to just get over it, I think would go a long way with helping us in general build resilience. And, and I like making resilience the goal rather than resolution.
Yes, right. It's a good plan of action, the resilience.
Right.
Because we're all going to experience losses. It's not like, you know, we've had our losses and that's it. As long as we're breathing and upright and taking fluids, we're going to have losses tomorrow and the next month. And even like she's pointing out with this pandemic, we're all grieving the loss of the way things were. Everything's changed. Our jobs, our way of interacting with people. You know, she talked about the caregivers and the remedy for caregivers who are grieving the changes that they are observing with their loved ones is human connections. Well, this is the best we can do right here. What we're doing today is a Zoom, but really, you know, the human connection of being together, I think, is protective and helpful. So we're grieving that, aren't we? Everybody is in some way, shape, or form, on top of all the other stuff.
Seems like it's multiplied at a level that we haven't dealt with before. When we talk about, you know, we've got over 150,000 deaths across the country, and every one of those deaths represent a family that's grieving, an extended family, and all the people that life touched. So it just compounds the lack of closure, and then does that spill over then in how we relate to others in this world today? And I'm thinking, my daughter called, and she's very concerned about me and her mom and this pandemic. We haven't seen her or our granddaughter, who is 4, since January. And my daughter's just like, what happens if you would get this and I don't get to see you? And so she's suffering as a result of that. And we do a lot of FaceTiming, reading books on, just try to stay in some kind of connection, because there is that underlying fear and uncertainty what tomorrow's going to bring.
Does she live out of town?
Yes, she lives in Columbus.
Columbus?
Yes, and of course Franklin County is in terrible shape in terms of the number of deaths and what's happening there. So she's hoping to come to visit some point, but when do you do that? I have some exposure because I'm still serving a congregation, which is in Henry County, which just experienced their first death, which also experienced their first hotspot or second hotspot. And it's a very challenging time.
It sure is. Well, thank you for serving your congregation in your community. Have you considered a porch visit where your daughter would come up and you could visit through a window?
We've talked about that. The other complication is my son-in-law's father had some kind of an issue, which they're not sure whether it's related to COVID or not, but it hospitalized him, and he is in and out of the hospital now. So now they're very cautious. In fact, they're not going anywhere. They're ordering everything in. They're both working from home because they're afraid that if they are exposed, then they don't get to see his dad. And if they're exposed, there's no chance of us seeing them. And, it just really complicates things. So they're being very cautious. We're being very cautious. And we just live with that at the moment. It's that resilience to try to figure out how to live in the midst of that environment.
And being hopeful. I mean, what's hard too is we don't have an end date, do we? With our Kingston community, we can't tell families, well, okay, you can start coming back into our building on September 1st. We can't even say that. That's what's so hard, is we don't have an end date, and that not knowing. But it all does come back to that resilience and just staying hopeful. We just really, really have to be hopeful and prayerful.
Right. Again, if I can jump in, this is Jean Dries. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Jean.
That's the part you just touched on, what I was thinking, which is there's no end date. And I know I'm not alone. And I think we all believe we have resilience, and you're trying to, adapt to the new norm, but it just keeps pushing out further and further. And I think that's where not only am I struggling, but lots of people, in that you kind of think you've seen the light at the end of the tunnel, and then it's pulled away from you again with resurgence. And so I don't know if there's any magic tip you or anyone can give to that, but fall, they always said winter would be maybe worse than fall, and now they're talking about Google employees are going to work from home through summer of 2021, and people are rolling this out like a whole year now, where they're just saying, if you can work from home, just work from home. So I have any thoughts anyone could lend on that, the resilience of the long-term unknown, I guess.
Anyone thoughts?
You hang on for the ride. It's going to be a roller coaster, I'm afraid.
And we're just having to get creative with our maintaining connection. I tell you, we can't lose connection. That's the downward spiral. Don't you all agree?
I think you're right.
We have to have connection. There are countless opportunities to Zoom or webinars, or meeting through a window, a walk. I've been doing walking meetings. I'm doing meetings. We meet at Olander Park or at Wildwood, and we walk with safe distance and, you know, mask, and just to get outside and fresh air. And we do have to have that connection and encourage each other, quite honestly.
I think that's true, Margaret. And I think rites of passage are really important too. So if you remember back in March, April, when this kind of started, and Facebook just blew up with how horrible it was that our kids were not going to have the kind of graduation that they've always had, right? Which it is. That's a loss, right? That expectations, when we have set expectations and they don't come to fruition, that's
Right.
That's a loss. But how communities and schools responded to our graduates, and the community parades and the big posters and the billboards, you know, with kids' pictures, and a different kind of graduation where families went in and got the diploma. I've heard so many stories of how much people appreciate that, and some of the seniors even appreciated it more than sitting through the 3-hour, you know, graduation that we all hated anyway.
That's right.
So, but it was that kind of that ritual and that acknowledgement of that transition that was important. And so, you know, the resilience comes with developing the ability to be adaptable and flexible. But what's really at the heart of what we need, and I think connection's one of those, acknowledgement and being listened to. And I like what she said about, you know, kind of living with with both answers. Yes, I'm really sad that we're going through this and I've lost A, B, and C, but I can also appreciate and look forward to, you know, X, Y, and Z, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yes, she that Krista, on that second piece that we listened to the first couple minutes, if you listen to that full, it's about a 30-minute follow-up. She does bring up the point about her own son graduating, and how that was the loss of that experience. And Pauline, you know, remember she gave the example of the importance of rituals, about the Thai family that still honors their dead by putting fresh food in the window of that restaurant. So the importance of rituals. I've had 2 nieces that had baby showers, and we did them on Zoom. It was actually better than in person, because we were, you know, Chicago, Ann Arbor, Columbus, Toledo, and everybody got on the screen, and we sent her gifts to her apartment, and she got on and was opening the gifts in front of all of us. It was actually kind of nice. We showed up in our pajamas because it was a morning brunch, and, you know, made our own little mimosa or coffee. And, you know, it was connection, but, you know, we continued that tradition of honoring the new baby and that type of thing. So
it's just different.
These are all examples of, I mean, these events that people have managed to do, you know, in spite of everything. That's to me, it's just kind of something to celebrate. I mean, instead of sort of maybe a lot of people being I felt sort of like I was, just speaking for myself, at the very beginning in March when we had the stay-at-home order that was issued. Okay, and whatever date that was in March, I was in a state of, I call it kind of paralysis. It was sort of like mesmerizing situation where you can't stay away from the news. You have to have the TV news on all the time. I mean, this was my experience. And a lot of people have said that's what happened to them. And I noticed that a friend of mine, though, had a totally opposite reaction. She wasn't sitting there. And again, you know, we're both widows. So she was in a situation in her own house. She's a widow. Her husband isn't there either. So, and she has no other relatives there. And she said, I'm just going to start making masks because I have a good sewing machine. And she just began immediately. And I don't know how many masks she's made. I mean, it's way over 1,000. Okay. And she started finding out, where are they asking for masks right now?
Wow.
And it was these various, I guess, people like janitorial staff and so on in some of the facilities who they couldn't afford to give masks to everybody there, you know? So they could use these cloth masks, just like she followed the rules. She had 2 layers of cotton. She was doing these, and she did various models. She does a great job. And I recently gave her a couple of pieces of material, and they were sentimental pieces that I had for a couple of different situations. And I said, I would love to have these made into 1 or 2 masks, whatever you can do. So she did that. Yeah, she did it for me. And this was 10 days ago. She's still, she said, I don't usually do it that way. I don't take personal orders.
Well, for you, she did. You're her friend.
But she did it for me. And I said, I said, I want to make a donation. It's kind of like you're the Salvation Army. And I said, you're giving and giving and giving. And I said, she says, no, I can't take any donations. And I said, no, just to pay for some of that elastic, you know, that you're buying.
Right.
Okay, but this woman, that was a total opposite reaction to everything. It was like, all right, this is something that I can do, and I'll help out.
Well, and that's her way of building resilience and contributing to prevention.
Right.
Now, I did notice that the health department's hiring contact tracers, and it's part-time and work from home. So if anybody feels called, it's $18 an hour. I mean, that would be a nice way to contribute towards prevention if that you feel might help a lot of you. I think it would be great. You know, you're simply making phone calls and contact tracers. That's through the Lucas County Health Department. And and like your friend making masks, you know, any way that you're contributing towards the prevention or educating others, that can be a form of building resilience too, because you're helping rather than cowering in fear and depression. We're, you know, contributing in some way, engaging folks, you know, calling. I think the area office on aging is going to be making these calls to some elders living in assisted living facilities. So we'll have to see as that rolls out. That might be nice to help people feel connected. And but great example. Is that Jackie? Or Jackie, is that who's your friend? What's your friend's name that makes the masks?
Well, I don't think you
do I know her? No,
okay. I don't think you. Let me think for a minute. No, I don't think you would have met her. I could broadcast her name.
Oh no, you don't have to.
No, no worries. Anyway, I doubt that you know her. No, it's not our friend from Nami. You know, Nami. Yeah. No, it's not a Nami connection. No, this person happens to be a retired registered nurse also. So it was automatic for her to think about the masks. You know what I mean?
Wasn't it? Well, it's a great gift of service.
Right.
Anybody else? Any other comments or thoughts before we close?
Well, I appreciated the part about you don't get over it, that it's, there are always those triggers that keep recurring. And that was good to know that we're okay if we're not over it.
Wasn't that refreshing to hear? Yes.
Oh yeah.
Agreed.
And also the difference between that depression that has to be treated clinically and that view of just sadness,
Right.
which is just treated with those connections we were just talking about. You know, make connections and, you know, work through the sadness with people. And it was also striking to me about how important those monuments are. And that could be the same with people. You know.
Yes.
This morning, my husband and I listened to a song, and it was called 5 More Minutes. And it talked about, oh, if I just only had 5 more minutes with my so-and-so who just passed away, you know. And he remembered his experience with some of his family members, and he didn't get some of that. But, you know, this fits.
I've heard that song, 5 More Minutes. It's very moving.
Yeah.
Is there a way of sometimes you'll have a connecting like email or something to be in touch with this psychiatrist? She's not a psychiatrist. She's they said, you know, this doctor
Pauline Boss.
Yeah. Is there a connecting
you know, I was going to look for that because I thought she would be an awesome speaker for our annual conference. What do you think, Sherry? I wondered if she would consider an invitation or what her cost rates might be, but I think she'd be a wonderful speaker. I'd love to hear more from her, actually.
It's a great idea.
Right. She
So
mentioned publishing. Well, she mentioned publishing papers, I think she was referring to. And I wondered if she's written a book or not on this.
Oh, she has. She has actually, yes. I think a couple books. I could get that information out to Sherry, and I think she has some email or a social media connection somewhere. I'll see what I can find out.
Okay.
She's wonderful, isn't she?
Maybe we Google her, we'll find some stuff, but I just was at one.
Well, I'm sure, yeah. I'd love to hear more from her, follow her.
That would be great. I agree, yeah.
Thanks for showing up, everyone.
Well, thank you for doing it.
That's a good topic, I thought. So lots of thought.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Just so you know, August 13th, we have Jen McCullough is going to do a self-care kind of yoga mindfulness presentation for us. And I'm not exactly sure how it will work, but we'll let you know and we'll send out that information soon.
Is that in the Lunch and Learn?
Yep,
Series?
11:30 to 1. Yep,
okay.
On August 13th.
Okay. Got it down. Thank you.
Great.
Right.
Thank you very much.
More people. Have a good day, everyone.
You too. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Margaret.
Bye, Jackie. Bye.
See you later. Right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sherry.
Bye-bye. Thanks again.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.